Hey y'all, I'm Pam with 44 Marketplace. And if today's your first visit to my channel, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. Please take a minute to subscribe and click the bell so you'll be notified each time I upload a video. If you like my videos, give me a thumbs up. And keep in mind, I try to put a material list in the comments below each one of the videos. If I missed something, please let me know. Okay, let's get started. Today, what we're going to talk about is something that I get asked a lot about, and I want to see if I can help you guys with it. Today, what we're going to talk about is getting a really ultra smooth finish. Now, some people, when they're painting furniture, they don't mind. They want brush strokes. I'm not one of those people. I like for mine to be as smooth as possible, and I know I spray. So I have lots of smooth finishes. I can get really smooth finishes sometimes. But I also brush a big part of my kitchens and things like that, and people are always complimentary about how smooth everything looks, and they're almost surprised at how smooth it is. So because this question gets asked a lot, I decided, what the heck, I would ask and see what you guys think as far as the best way to get smooth finishes. So if your piece has a lot of texture and a lot of detail, something like this, it's pretty easy to hide any brush strokes and things like that because they kind of get lost in the detail, right? So that's not a big deal. And if you've got something like this that has a little bit of a pattern to it, it's pretty easy to make that come away. But if you have something that's nice and ultra smooth like this is, it's pretty hard to end up with a smooth finish at times. And some of that is related to A, the amount of product you're using, B, the amount of water you're using, and C, the amount of pressure that you're using. So that's what we're going to go over tonight. It's going to be a quick live because, like I say, I was in a kitchen all day and I've got a lot of things going, but I did promise and I do want to fulfill those promises. And I've got hair everywhere. It's been braided up today and it's been crazy. Okay, so if you've got a piece like this, there's a lot of texture to it, right? But if you have the piece like this that's very smooth up front, then you can see how you would have a problem. First of all, let me tell you, it's related to your brush, okay? It is related to your brush. Now, I'm not saying you have to have a Dixie Belle brush. I'm saying you have to have a good brush. You may be a synthetic person like me. You may be a natural bristle person like a lot of my friends are. But I will tell you the way that I get my finishes as smooth as I do in my kitchens, and like I said today, I brushed a lot of a kitchen today, and so that's why I want you to know the best way to do it. For me, the best way to do it is I like to start with a good brush. In my case, most of the time I use my Dixie Belle Mini Angled because it's my favorite, but I do better with synthetic bristles, and the reason is because they have split ends. Not something we want on our hair, but it is something that is great to have on your brush because it spreads the bristle out so that you're not having a coarse bristle, something like this, okay? You want to spread those bristles out, and that's going to distribute the paint more evenly. Another thing is, and a lot of people I see make this mistake when they're painting, your paint shouldn't, those little white lines, I try not to get more paint than that on my brush. Where those little white tips are on my bristle, you never want to have more paint on your brush than a 1/3 of your bristle. Now, when you're painting in a kitchen like I do, over time, the amount that is in your brush will go up slightly. But when you load your brush, you don't want but just a little bit of product in there. Those of you who use Dixie Belle paint, or any kind of chalk paint for that matter, you know how far it goes. So not only do I want my brush damp, I use a mister bottle, but you want a little bit of product. A little bit of product. I can't stress that enough. When you are loading your brush, I'm going to show you. A lot of times, even when I'm in a kitchen, I start with the product that's in my lid, okay? So I get just the tips of my bristle. There you go. See? I don't want a ton of product on my brush. And when I get ready to brush it, smooth, fluid motion. As long a stroke as you can make on your piece. The little quick motions back and forth, that is what is going to give you your brush strokes, okay? Another thing that really helps is if you make your as fluid a motion, like I said. Another thing is don't overwork your product. Don't go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth over your product. The whole purpose, well, of course I would touch it with my fingers. The whole purpose is just to go over it as few a times as you possibly can. That is another thing. A lot of people that are doing this, they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And that dries your product in places and leaves damp places in your product. And that will also cause you to have places that are overworked, and that's going to give you brush strokes. I'm just going to tell you, you don't want that. If you can do it in one stroke, do it. Don't do this. Do it in one long stroke. Because when you look at this, even though this is light over dark, can you see most of those will disappear when this paint dries, because this paint is self-leveling and all of that. Another thing to keep in mind is if you see a boo-boo after your paint starts drying, don't touch it. Don't touch it at all, because it is much easier to fix once your paint is dry versus messing around with it while your paint is still wet. Then a little boo-boo becomes a big giant boo-boo and requires sanding. So what you're going to do is you let it dry. Let it dry. If it's already started drying, you notice a run or whatever, let it dry. It's much easier to fix. And the magic is a 320 grain sandpaper. Always, when you're painting, keep this. Now, do I sand between coats? Typically, I do not sand between coats, but in all fairness, I do spray most of my base coats and my top coats, so I don't need to sand between coats. Do I sand before I spray my top coat? Yeah, a lot of times I do, but between my layers of top coat, I do sand. Lightly with a 320 grain. Now, can I say I do that every time? No, I can't. But I can tell you something I do. How many of you guys have a furniture finishing pad? One of the white, it looks kind of like a white Scotch-Brite pad. You need one of those, and when you've finished your piece, you paint it, and then you've top coated it, you can either do something like this, a 320 grain, which will not scratch your paint up. It'll just lightly smooth it down, or you need a furniture finishing pad. But first and foremost, you need to make sure you get this finish smooth before you start putting that top coat on. Another thing to remember is when you're working with your paint, you can see as it's drying. If it's already started drying, don't brush back over it with just your brush. If you're going to reactivate it, use your mister bottle. You want everything to be equally damp or equally dry, because otherwise that's when you're going to get more brush strokes. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing it is when you're going light over dark or dark over light, the first coat is going to show brush strokes. There's no way to get around it. The first coat is going to show brush strokes. Don't panic. Don't keep brushing it. Don't keep adding more product, because the more product you add, the more of a chance that you're going to get too much product, which is going to be too deep, which is going to give you brush strokes. So always just do a light coat, and once you get a light coat on there, then let it dry. Walk away. Whatever you have to do, just let it dry, because that's not what you want. You don't want to mess with it while it's wet. Sorry, I have a hair in my face that's about to drive me insane. So once it has dried, then you put your second coat on. Now, that's when, if you notice a boo-boo in your first coat, you notice a run, you notice excessive brush strokes or whatever, that's when you change your game. You can use a 320 grain. Some people use a 220, but I like a 320. Lightly sand. You're not sanding it to get the finish off. You're sanding it to smooth it out. And once you lightly sand it, then you're golden. Once you lightly sand it, then you put your second coat on. Remember, the same rules apply. Use a brush. If you use a damp brush, make sure and use a damp brush. Make sure you use a good brush. And lightly put your second coat on and allow it to dry. After your second coat is dried, that's when you can add your top coat or your wax or whatever you choose. But keep in mind, you're looking for no brush strokes most of the time. And I'll tell you, the majority of the time, I was hoping this would dry while I was talking so that we could put our second coat on, but I think the humidity's too high here. That's what you're going for. Ultimately, you are going for as smooth a finish as you can get. But if you happen to notice that when you put your second coat on that you do still have brush strokes, go back in with that 320 and lightly sand it, and maybe you need a very light, Heather calls it a half coat. Maybe you need just a little bit more paint in places just to smooth everything out. But I'm telling you, if you take your 320 grain, it will make it nice and smooth and you can put your top coat on. But you're so much better off not to overwork it. And then we get to our top coats. Top coats, especially gator hide, is one of those things that people have problems with. And the reason you have problems with it is because you overwork it. You paint and paint and you paint and you paint and you paint and you paint. When you put your top coats on, you want even less in your brush than you do with paint. Top coats, you just want enough to do one stroke across. And always keep in mind, guys, when you're doing your paint, if you start going this direction, then that's the direction you need to keep going. Because if I had done it this way and then done it this way, it's never going to look good. You're still going to see brush strokes. So unless you're trying to do a basket weave, you really want to try to keep going in the same direction when you're doing your paint and your top coats. Now, if you're doing countertops and you're trying to do a basket weave or something, I get it. But for the average piece of furniture, to keep from having brush strokes, you're going to want to go in the same direction, light coats. In most cases, like I say, I use my mister, but I always use a good brush, and I always use just a little bit of paint, because you don't want to have too much paint on your piece at a time, because that is where it's going to be. A lot of people don't realize, but 2 coats of paint and a coat of gator hide can equal 1/16 of an inch of paint on your piece. Did you realize that? So a 1/16 of an inch is plenty deep enough if you're pressing down hard with your brush or something to end up with brush strokes. So make sure when you do it, I don't think you can tell here, but can you see? Most every one of those brush strokes are gone. My fingerprints are there, but most of those brush strokes have completely disappeared as this is drying. So that's what I want to impress upon you. Please make sure that you keep your brush damp. And I don't mean damp with product. I like it damp with water. Use a good brush and a little bit of product at a time, and don't overwork it. And you'll always have a smooth finish. Another thing to remember is when you've got edges like this, if you can't brush down the edge, brush to the edge. Because if you brush against this edge, you're going to have puddling here. Whereas if you brush away from the edge, like this one, if I brush this way, I'm going to have very little product come here. See how smooth that is for the most part? But if I brush to this edge, I'm going to have more product to puddle there. So that's another thing. If you're putting top coat on, make sure you get all of your edges, because any drips or any puddling can turn yellow. And it's not that your top coat is yellowing, it looks amber because it's puddling in places. So that is something to think about. And I can't see any comments because I don't know why. Comments aren't showing up at all tonight. So I will read the comments and answer any questions, but that is just what I wanted to show you guys. If you have something smooth, and I was hoping this would dry, but we are not dry. Oh, that side might be almost dry. All right, so we're going to put our second coat on right quick, and hopefully it's dry enough. My brush is no longer dry. No longer wet. So then I'm going to go back in, and I'm going to go the same direction. And look at that. See what great coverage that second coat gives? It gives beautiful coverage with Dixie Belle. That second coat makes all the difference in the world. And when this dries, there'll be almost no brush strokes whatsoever, because I used a good brush, I kept it damp, and I used a little bit of product. So, I appreciate you guys watching. It didn't take but about 15 minutes of your night. And if you have a friend that's been having problems getting that brush strokeless finish, please pass this along, and I will see you guys tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thanks a bunch.